Hello again. We can get started with our third panelist, Jeremy Bai, aka Deathblade, translator of I Shall Seal the Heavens, A Will Eternal, some other works as well, and an author of his own original works. He's been affiliated with Wuxia World, which actually got me started into reading Chinese Wuxia and Xianxia novels, particularly. But I think, how long did it take for you to translate I Shall Seal the Heavens? Is it 7 years or?
No, I from the very beginning to the end was probably about 2 years, I think.
I think it was 7 years ago. Maybe is when it started. But yeah, thank you for translating that. I think that was one of my. I mean, it is one of my favorite Chinese web fiction novels to read, and I think you do a fantastic job at bringing to life these characters from a completely different culture, way of life, and I think you've earned a lot of fans as well. I know you're on YouTube as well. You've done a lot of commentary videos on Chinese culture, Chinese novels, etc. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. I'm in Southern California, San Diego, and we're having like a freak thunderstorm, which never ever happens. So if you hear some booming in the background, I apologize. But anyway, it's good to be here. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Sounds good. Right off the bat, so I've been enjoying reading your novel, Eight Heirs of Sun and Storm. What are you up to now? Are you working on a sequel, I believe, or are you still translating actively?
I'm not translating actively. I actually have finished with that series, Heirs of Sun and Storm. I actually have the first book right here. This is the paperback version of the first book. There's three total. I finished that series. I did launch a series on Royal Road recently. I actually already finished that. It's not really a web novel series per se. I actually sold that. It's a trilogy that I already sold to my publisher, and they suggested to try posting it on Royal Road. So I did that, and I'm actually done with it already with book one. So if you're interested in checking it out, you can check that out. It's called Imminent Ascension. The version on Royal Road is not as polished as I usually like my work to be. To be perfectly honest, I don't think I'm very good at serialized fiction. The way I think of writing as like sculpting sort of, and I like to get my kind of rough like shape, and then I kind of start adding details and going back and changing things and stuff like that. So for me to regularly post serialized fiction, it's a lot harder for me. Anyway, so I have that series that's ongoing, and then I'm also kind of toying with the idea of launching a Xianxia lit RPG series on Railroad as well, because that's kind of my thing, Chinese genres. And I've been kind of poking around, asking around, reading some of the different Xianxia lit RPG stuff on Railroad. There's some really cool stuff, but there isn't very much that I would consider to be real, true Chinese style Xianxia plus lit RPG. A lot of times, it seems like the lit RPG aspect kind of just fades away and it just becomes like a Xianxia novel. So I'm hoping to crank out a cool Xianxia lit RPG novel and put that on Royal Road as well. So that's kind of what I'm up to right now. So yeah.
Awesome. And I'll look forward to checking this lit RPG. I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher it. Xianxia
Yeah.
novel. And I know you got your start even before I Shall Seal the Heavens. You mentioned somewhere in a video or perhaps that you got started translating traditional wuxia novels. And would those be like the I forget the name, but like Seven Blades or something was one that I read on Wuxia World. So what was that like? How did you learn Chinese? How did you start reading wuxia novels and eventually build a career out of it?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll say before I start that like you mentioned, I have a YouTube channel and I have videos where I've gone into detail about all this stuff. So I think collectively those videos are probably 30 minutes long in and of themselves. So if you want the full backstory, you can check out the story on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/deathblade. But to kind of answer your question as fast as I can, basically, I got interested in Chinese culture and the language primarily because of the movie Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And that really sparked my imagination and my interest. And that led me down a path of learning the language and then traveling to China. Then eventually I moved to China. And leading up, before I moved there, there was kind of a spike in, or there was a golden age sort of like wuxia fan translations. It was actually after Crouching Tiger came out that a lot of people, I would say probably primarily Chinese people who could speak English, were translating the famous novels. And so I was reading those, and I just loved them. And so then go forward a few years, I'm in China. I've been studying Chinese for a while, and I made a mistake in that I thought when I started learning Chinese that I was like, I'm not going to bother with Chinese characters. It's too complicated. I don't really need it. Then I ended up in China, and I'm like, okay, that was probably a bad decision because everything's Chinese characters. I can't read anything. And so I took it more seriously. And as a teacher of English at the time, I was always telling the parents of my students, because my students were children usually, I was always telling them, oh, you need to read. Like, you need to read English, read stories and stuff to improve your language. And I was thinking, well, wait a second, I'm not really practicing what I'm preaching. And if I want to get good at reading Chinese characters, then I probably ought to be reading some Chinese. And I was like, well, what would be an interesting thing to read? I'm not into the news. I wasn't interested in reading, like textbooks and whatnot. So I thought, well, how about wuxia? Like, that's kind of what got me into this path of learning Chinese to begin with. And so I tried to find the shortest wuxia novel I could find, which is the novel by Gulong. He's one of the most famous wuxia novelists. And maybe it's even like not even considered a novel. I'm not sure. It might be a novelette. It's really short. I found it. I read it on my phone, and it was a little bit easier than I thought. And then I was thinking, well, wait a second. I used to read all these fan translations of wuxia novels, and I just read this wuxia novel. Why don't I try translating it? No one's translated it. And so that's what I did. And that led to me translating that novel, and then another one and another one and another one. And after 4 of those more traditional wuxia novels, well, one of them is actually a modern paranormal horror wuxia by a Taiwanese author. But anyway, after those 4 novels, I started doing I Shall Seal the Heavens at the recommendation of the owner of Wuxia World. And then, just kind of here we are today.
Awesome. Yeah, again, I really, really enjoyed I Shall Seal the Heavens and being part of the F5 sect, I believe.
Yeah.
Just like sitting there, clicking refresh. Yeah, I started reading early on.
Awesome.
So you mentioned earlier that writing for you is, you have in your mind the model of writing where you're sculpting. And was that something that developed when you were starting writing, or how did being a translator translate into being a writer or becoming a writer?
I mean, it's a complicated answer. Similar to Inadvisably Compelled. You can tell I got a lot of gray hairs here. I'm also getting up there in age. I've got 2 kids, but I also have been a writer my whole life. My mom is a scrapbooker kind of person, and she has like little stories and school projects that I wrote going back to elementary school. I just was going through stuff the other day. I found this when I was in middle school. I wrote a sequel to Lord of the Flies, where the kids get like kidnapped by aliens, and go out into space, and they do time travel, and then somehow one of them ends up. If you read Lord of the Flies, you remember there's this one part where there's this paratrooper that lands on the mountain, and like it's a big part of the plot. Well, in my version, that's actually one of the kids from the story that went to the future and then traveled back and blah blah blah. So I've always been interested in writing and storytelling, but the translating really put a huge, it spun everything, because Chinese style of storytelling is different than Western storytelling, I think. And it just, when you sit in the shoes of because when you're translating, you're sort of sitting in the shoes of the author, kind of relaying their thoughts, from one language into another. If you've read I Shall Seal the Heavens, you might remember there's this scene where there's this sort of mysterious ghost boat sort of thing that kind of appears a few times. And one time the main character, Meng Hao, he gets sort of saved by this like boat, this ghost boat thing. Yeah. And he's kind of walking around on there, and there's this like phantom guy that he can't talk to or interact with, but this phantom person on this boat is like practicing cultivation at the front of the boat. And so he eventually sits down in the exact position of this guy and starts mimicking his movements, and he starts cultivating in the same way. And then he achieves some enlightenment or breakthrough or something. And I kind of felt like that was me with the author, because I was sitting there, my fingers are moving on the keyboard. I'm writing the same story, except I'm not really inventing it. I'm just kind of, I'm taking his story and putting it into another language. And when you do that for like I Shall Still the Heavens is, I think 3 million words, English words at the end. A Will Eternal is a little bit less than that. And then the novel I translated after that, also several million English words. So by the time I did all of that, it made an indelible impression on my mind, I think. And now whether that's for better or for worse, I'm not going to say, but it definitely changed the way I, stuff from my brain goes into my fingers to the keyboard and then onto the paper. And so, for example, the series Heirs of Sun and Storm, which we were talking about earlier, definitely has a lot of Chinese storytelling elements that I don't even realize are there. I have a team of alpha readers and beta readers, and many times they're pointing out things that I haven't even thought about, that are just kind of coming out that I think are influenced by that. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but it definitely that doing that much storytelling, or not even, it's not really storytelling. It's recounting the story that someone else told. I don't think it would be possible to do that much, as much as I've done, and have it not affect you. So that's why in my own writing, I do try to lean into that, and I try to emulate and pay homage to the genres that I've translated so much, because I think that it's going to happen anyway, basically.
Yeah, but I think you definitely add your unique twists to it. I think Heirs of Sun and Storm, a lot of sci-fi elements, urban fantasy, if you will, although not in the traditional English sense, but as well as Imminent Ascension, I think is set in a completely like European twist on a fantasy world. And another thing that I've noticed is that although your translation work, a lot of it has focused on web fictions and web novels, which are serialized. I've noticed in Heirs of the Sun and Storm, it's written more like a traditional novel. Was that a conscious decision, or in terms of storytelling? And could I pick your brains a little bit about that decision?
Sure. Yeah, that was intentional. Being as old as I am, I guess I definitely have a much bigger foundation in sort of traditional novels. I read, my dad's also a big science fiction fan. He has collections of books that he started collecting in the 50s. And so I have a big background in that kind of stuff. And so that's kind of what interests me the most. And so when I did Heirs of Sun and Storm, it wasn't intended to be web fiction at all. And so I did plan out those books as I would imagine, them. When I was imagining them, I should say, I was thinking of them just being actual books. The first book, The Sun's Blood, was actually 3 books originally. I self-published them, 3 shorter books, and then they got picked up by a publisher. And now it's that giant thing that I was just holding. But I'm really interested in storytelling and plot structure and characters and stuff. I've always been interested in that. I remember learning, I went to school not for writing, but for art, actually. My degree is in animation. But as part of animation, you study acting and you study storytelling and stuff. That's where I heard about the hero's journey, and that leads you down a whole rabbit hole of things to learn about. So in any case, there's definitely a big difference between how you approach serialized fiction and how you approach the more traditional kind. And I kind of am interested in both. I think for the one I was telling you about that I'm planning to do, that Xianxia Lit RPG, I'm approaching that as I would imagine a traditional, like, serialized web novelist would do.
I see.
My other stuff, not so much. So yeah.
Okay, cool. I think one common conception of serialized web fiction, not for the panelists here, but are that they are, slightly lower in quality, perhaps, because they, it's just, especially with Chinese and Eastern web fictions, because it's on a daily serialization schedule. A strategy that a lot of American web fiction authors do is just they amass a gigantic bank of chapters. But in Eastern web fiction industry. Like IC mentioned, the turnover is really quick, so fast. And if one thing goes really popular, this next month, there's like 10, 20, everybody's trying to copy that formula. So what has been your kind of perspective on the Eastern web fiction industry as opposed to perhaps what you've seen on Royal Road or in the traditional publishing space? And what kind of things would you say, what tips would you have for people in either community?
Well, first of all, I should state right off the bat that I don't think I'm an expert in that kind of stuff by any stretch of the imagination. The two other panelists obviously have way more experience producing, serialized content than I do. And a lot of my perceptions are just based on observations and things that I've, heard. I have been in China and I have interacted some with authors there. So I do know a little bit of kind of the behind the scenes. I honestly think that in my perception, they're very similar in terms of the day-to-day process of producing content and releasing content. It seems very similar from what I've seen between the West and the East. The authors, like the author of I Shall Sail the Heavens and A Will Eternal, I've hung out with him a couple of times and been able to learn a few things from him about his process. Just like Western authors, he builds up a stockpile of chapters and then releases them later. He does outline his story ahead of time. Now, I know not all authors do that. I think whether it's East or West, some authors like to outline more, some outline less, but he does have an outline. He does revise his outline as he goes along, similar to the way that a lot of Western authors might revise their outline. So there's a lot of similarities between the two. I think another similarity, and the other panelists can correct me if I'm wrong here, because I'm not super familiar with how all the Western web novelists work, but in my perception is that there isn't a lot of editing of the content before release. I'm not saying there's none, but like with my experience with Argon, the author of I Shall Sail the Heavens, he does revise his chapters. I'm going to insert my question into the queue of questions and answers for the other authors when we get to that. But I am curious how much revision they do. I know that with Argon, he will write and then he'll go back and read it and revise it. And then he'll kind of make his final version and then launch it, but I don't think he does much more than one revision. For me, and I'm really sort of anal about this kind of stuff, I go through revision after revision after revision. Just so many revisions, but I don't know. That's just, I can't stop myself from doing that. Even the novel you mentioned, Imminent Ascension, even when I was doing it on Royal Road, I think I revised each chapter probably 5 or 6 times before releasing it. And then after releasing it, now that it's finished, I printed it out and I had beta readers read it, and then I made changes, and then I read the whole thing and I redlined it, and I'm going to revise it again. And maybe I'm crazy for doing that, but just I have to do it. So anyway, I'm curious. I'm actually curious about how other authors handle that as well.
Yeah, but it definitely sounds like you have an affinity for more traditional forms of writing, perhaps, because that's when you go through many, many revisions. And I think that's actually an English professor I know says that editing is really the key to good writing.
Yeah.
You'll go through tens, dozens.
For me, I like to, there's always this conversation among writers about whether you're a discovery writer or an outline writer or whatever. There's different words for that. But basically, do you plan everything out in advance and then write it? Or do you kind of make it up as you go along? And there's different schools of thought. And I'm kind of like, I'm in the middle. I like to plan it out, but I also like to make it up as I go along. And so for me, sometimes the coolest ideas, especially toward the end of either a novel or a story arc, sometimes the coolest ideas for me come up while I'm writing those chapters. But then if I don't lay the groundwork for it earlier, then it comes across as like Deus Ex Machina, just random stuff comes up. And so for me, I like to go through that process of planning, executing, but then I like to go back to make sure all that proper groundwork is laid. And so that's why for me, I feel like I'm actually kind of a sucky web novelist because I don't know how the other guys do it. Amend my question from before. I'm really curious how the good web novelists manage to do all this cool stuff and not like, think of it 30 chapters ahead of time and then kind of lay the groundwork. And then all of a sudden there's this cool payoff. And you're like, wow, like my mind doesn't work that way. Maybe that's why I suck at chess too, because I can't really think more than 1 or 2 moves ahead in chess. So maybe it's a similar thing.
Well, maybe, but one step at a time. And I think you've done a great job for yourself. So I think right now we can move on to questions for a few minutes. Okay, so the first one for you is from a longtime fan. Bought Chinese Lego sets from you back in the day. With your experiences as a translator and author, what advice would you give to your kids if they say they'd like to get into writing? And also, they like your shirt.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
I got my Mighty Nine shirt on today. Well, I actually do have kids, and they are interested in that kind of stuff. So that's a pretty relevant question, and I think the same advice that I mentioned before about that I would give to my students in China is the same advice I would give to parents that are interested in fostering an interest in writing and reading in their kids. And it's the same thing I do for my kids. And that's just get them interested in reading. And different kids are different. That's something that if you're, sometimes not all parents realize this, because if a parent doesn't have a lot of interaction with a lot of other kids, they might, even I tend to do this, fall into this trap of thinking, oh, the way that I'm doing it with my kids is the way that works. So I'm going to tell everybody else how this works. But so many different kinds of children and personalities. And so every kid is different. For my kids, my daughter's 2, my son is 6. And for my son, so my daughter's not quite at the point where I feel like I can really comment on the success of my methods. But for my son, I tried to get him interested in books and stuff from when he was a little kid. When he was just a baby, I would read him picture books.
Maybe Deathblade. Yeah.
We have I would try to do bedtime story regularly. And right now he is a super avid reader. I mean, he's in kindergarten. I think his reading level is probably around 3rd grade, maybe 4th. Like he's 6, but he's reading Diary of a Wimpy Kid, which I think is targeting a little bit older readers. He loves comic books. He loves making his own comic books. He loves scripting his own comic books. But I think that for kids, starting early and trying to build that foundation is the key.
Cool. I think we have time for one more. It's from a massive fan, IA, Imminent Ascension, I assume, as well as A Will Eternal. Question about do Ling Fei and A Will Eternal, do you feel their ending could have had more of a better ending? They feel it might have been a little bit unfulfilling and could have had a better conclusion.
Okay, that's a hard question. I think that if you read the author's previous novels, he generally had single love interests. I haven't read Renegade Immortal and Pursuit of the Truth, but I generally know the story of them. And also with I Shall Seal the Heavens, he had a single love interest, but with a kind of third wheel love interest. That now here's the thing, which I haven't talked about before, I don't think anywhere. So this is exclusive information. The author changed his intention for the story based on reader reaction. So in I Shall Seal the Heavens, his main love interest was Xu Qiang, but there's also Chu Yuyan. He never intended Chu Yuyan to be so important, but people liked her so much that he ended up changing his idea to kind of fulfill the fans' desires. And in the end of the novel, spoilers here, turn off your volume if you haven't read I Shall Seal the Heavens, but in the end, it vaguely implies that the main character is going to end up with both of them, but it doesn't really say that. The point is, none of his previous novels were anything like a harem, but with A Will Eternal, he intentionally went that route. And so did he fulfill the Dueling Fae storyline? In my personal opinion, I would say probably not. But I think he, had a choice to make, and he wanted to have it end with the main character having a bunch of different love interests all together. And so, it is what it is.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much for dissecting the romantic elements of Chinese web novels, as well as your experiences as a translator and author. And hopefully you can get to some of these questions. No worries if not. And we'll take a break for a few minutes and be back with our last panelist, last but not least.